In our modern political landscape, you may have come across the term socialism from time to time. You might see the term associated with some of the more progressive politicians that the US left has to offer. And you might see the US right throwing around that term like it's an insult. Depending on who you ask, you'll get a whole host of reactions and opinions on socialism. In the US, many Americans have been taught since birth that it's essentially a bit of a boogeyman through 100 years of Red Scare propaganda. But in this video, my goal is to break through the propaganda and describe how this worldview is infinitely more beneficial to the average American, to the 99%. So let's break it down. Socialism can be defined as a political and economic theory that advocates that the means of production be owned collectively, or by the whole community, not just a select few people. But what does that really mean? What are the means of production? Well, they're the necessary assets and resources used to produce goods and services in our economy. In other words, factories, machinery, land, raw materials, stuff like that. In our current capitalist economic system, it's a select few who own these raw materials, who own the means of production, the capitalist class. Think any billionaire, landowner, etc. And it's in this ownership where the balance of power shifts heavily towards the capitalist class. Through their ownership, capital owners accumulate, well, capital. Capital being essentially a unit of value. But there's one ingredient missing in this equation, because the means of production by themselves don't produce any inherent value. A piece of machinery by itself can't produce anything. Value is created in an economy through labor. In other words, it's created through you, through me, through any member of the working class that uses the means of production to produce a good or a service. Without labor, there is no production and there's no value. So as you know, in our current economic system, we're typically paid some sort of wage for our labor, be that salary, hourly, stipend, etc. But in a capitalist system, the wages that we're paid, that wage value, is by definition always going to be less than the actual value that we bring in, our productive value. Why is that? Well, if you take the value that we create, our productive value, and you subtract out the wages that we're paid, that wage value, you get a surplus. Or in terms that we're more familiar with, profit, that the capital owners essentially collect off our backs. This is productive value that we created through our labor. But by definition, we're not paid the full value of what we create. It's siphoned from us. Profit, therefore, as an idea, is inherently exploitative. It's quite literally the idea of leeching off of the working class, siphoning value from them, from us. And this idea is normalized, even celebrated. We're taught to look up to these titans of industry as role models, as examples. In truth, these capital owners, no matter how visionary or intelligent that they may be painted out to be, are inherently leeches by definition, because we create their wealth. We produce that value as a working class. Remember, without labor, there is no production, there is no value. Yet all that value concentrates under the hands of a few in the current capitalist system. That means every latte you make, every package you deliver, every patient that you help, any single good or service that you create or provide through your labor at your place of employment is an instance where a capital owner is by definition exploiting you, by definition not giving you the full value of what you created. And that sucks for the vast majority of people, for the 99% of people who are taken advantage of and who are owed a seat at the table. So now, what's the alternative? Well, the idea is that a socialist system would democratize this wealth, not just by redistribution, but by flipping this entire concept of ownership on its head. As opposed to a select few owning the means of production, remember the factories, the land, the machinery, and therefore, through their ownership, being able to exploit us, to extract that surplus value from us, the idea is instead that each worker is part of the collective who jointly owns the means of production. This means that the idea of private property or private ownership of the means of production would be abolished. Singular individuals would no longer be the owners of anything that is used to engage in production. Now, one important note, and people get this mixed up a lot, and it's used as sort of like a gotcha against socialism, but really, it's not the case. Private property is not personal property. There's a very big difference. Private property is, like I said, property that's used specifically for the purposes of production. Again, factories, machineries, etc. Personal property is property that is not used for production. A really good example is like the house that you live in. that is totally accepted and valued in a socialist society. Now, if you plan on using that home as a rental property, then it does become private property because, you're extracting profit from your tenants as the landlord. But personal property for personal use is totally fair game. Socialists aren't trying to have your toothbrush be collectively owned. It's only the means of production that we seek to take out of the hands of a few and into the ownership, the collective ownership of the many. And as a result of doing this, a socialist society would remove the profit motive entirely. Because again, profit is synonymous with the exploitation of someone. If someone's generating a profit, somewhere down the line, someone is being exploited. So the motive, therefore, for any productive action in this socialist society would no longer be for a select few individuals or for corporations to turn a profit. The motive instead would be for collective utility, or what benefits the collective society or even the planet the best. And so naturally, this ideology is pretty threatening to the rule of the current capitalist class. Think billionaires, corporations, politicians on both sides of the spectrum. This is why socialism in America has gotten a lot of pushback through like 100 years of Red Scare propaganda, as well as a lot of documented instances of us meddling in other countries for the purposes of preserving democracy. As you can probably tell, that's the American way of saying we're just protecting our capital interests. But despite this constant pushback, we outnumber the ruling class. It's not even close, which is why any newly minted socialist added to our collective brings us that much closer to a society that works for the many, not just a few. This is the mission of DSA, bringing that vision of democratic socialism to the US, where everyone's voice is heard and everybody is fairly compensated for their labor. So, if you're excited about a socialist movement in the United States, make sure to get in contact with your local DSA chapter to get involved. Either visit dsausa.org to get in touch with our national organization, or if you happen to be in the Huron Valley area of Michigan, visit hvdsa.org. And make sure to subscribe. We got a lot of videos coming giving educational info on socialism, as well as updates on our organization. For now, this is Adrian of HVDSA, signing off.